Chuck jaws. Every chuck comes with a basic set of jaws. Is that good enough for you? Well, the answer depends on each, varies with each wood turner. But in this video, I want to show you some things about jaws that will help you make a wiser decision if you're thinking about buying some more jaws. Hi y'all, Mike Peace, Woodturning. I'm here to share with you tips, tricks, and techniques to help make you a better turner. If this is something that's of interest to you, please subscribe and ring the notifications bell so you won't miss any future videos. I want to give this shout out to James Davis for suggesting this topic. Thanks, James. I think every woodturner has personal preferences, and there may be a tendency to overstate the particular advantages or disadvantages of a particular one. So I think you need to take advice with a certain grain of salt. So what are my preferences? What I'm going to cover is based on the jaws and the chucks that I'm familiar with and that I've used, but a lot of the discussion will carry over and would apply equally to other manufacturers. I'm using Technitool chucks because that's what I started with, and I decided to stick with them because I had an investment in jaws that came when I bought my used mini lathe. It came with a set of jaws. Here are the jaws that I'm going to discuss, and like I say in this discussion, much of it will be transferable to other manufacturers, whether it's a one-way or a Vic Mark or some other chuck manufacturer. So I think one of the first considerations is, what is it that you're going to turn? What causes you to think you're going to need something bigger? Now in general, a larger tenon or a larger recess supports bigger projects. You know, if you're going to turn bowls like this, you can't do that with your standard set of jaws. It's not safe. You might get away with it once or twice, but it's not safe, and sooner or later it's going to bite you. But in general, larger jaws for larger work, smaller jaws for smaller work. Now I do a lot of small work, and I quickly discovered that I needed a small set of jaws. And as it turns out, I wound up having several that came with my used mini lathe, but then I found later that they weren't suitable for me. A second consideration is what is your budget? Obviously, if you have an unlimited budget, you can buy everything out there from a particular manufacturer. But most people have constraints, so that is a serious factor. A factor of that is, for some people, there's some advantage if you're starting out getting a chuck such as the Nova Infinity chuck or the Easy Wood chuck. There's newer chuck designs out on the market that have quick change jaws, and my chucks are not one of them. The chucks are generally considerably more expensive, but you just push an indent or twist a button or something and the jaws come right out, and you can take another set of jaws and put them right in, and it's a very quick change. That could be a very nice feature, and for some people if you're starting out, although my preference is to not have to change the jaws too much by having different size chucks. There's two types of chucks I'm aware of that have that feature. There's the Easy Wood chuck, and then there's the Technitool, I believe it's called the Infinity chuck. And for the Technitool, you can retrofit other jaws, but it's not a cheap retrofit. You got to buy a different set of glides, and then you have to buy a set of attachments that go on every set of jaws. So to me, it's just not worth the expense. Another aspect of your budget is, you know, is the project you've got in mind, is it a one-off, something you're going to do one time? If so, there's generally alternative ways of doing it. If you're going to turn your one BFB, you don't need to have a set of jaws. You could get by doing this with a faceplate. Jaws in general are not requirements. They make things easier, they make things faster, and in some cases they make things safer. Let's first talk about the standard jaw set. And it's going to vary from chuck manufacturer, but they're going to be approximately 2 inches. Recess or tenon, well, it depends on your chuck, but they're going to be approximately 2 inches. There are variations, obviously. If you get a larger chuck, such as this Titan chuck, or if you get a one-way stronghold. But your typical chucks, they'll come with a set of jaws similar to this, and that may be good enough. Now, let's talk about the profile shape. Now, they're going to vary. Now, in this particular one, it has dovetail on the outside for a recess, and it has this very narrow, what I call a hawk beak very small dovetail that you don't cut when you're making a recess. The manufacturer is very clear about that when you read their instructions. So if you've got a Techni-Tool, don't get confused about making a tenon a recess for making a dovetail fitting for a tenon. Now this set of jaws comes with all three of the Nova chucks, the G3, the Precision MIDI, as well as the Supernova 2. And I discussed this jaws in an earlier video where I did a review of the Record Power SC4, so you might want to go back and check out that video. They also sell a set of smaller jaws similar to this. Now these are Patriot jaws. The reason I'm mentioning this is that with almost very few exceptions, generally the one I'm going to mention, jaws are not interchangeable from one manufacturer to another. Matter of fact, even within the same manufacturer, typically if you change size of the chuck, you can't use jaws from a different chuck size even by the same manufacturer. That's true of One Way, that's true of Vicmark, and most of the others. Now there is an exception, and that's the Nova chucks, or the Techni-Tool chucks. They do have an interchangeable jaw set that's compatible with the Sorby Patriot and the Record Power chucks. And like I say, I discussed that a little bit more in detail in the review of the Record Power. So that is a consideration. But if you have those particular, one of those chucks, the benefit is you don't have to be, you're not restricted to the manufacturer. You might find a different profile. For example, I bought these jaws because when I bought my mini lathe, it came with, let me back up. When I got my used mini lathe, when I started wood turning 11 years ago, it came with this set of 35mm Picket Jaws, these long jaws, these 25mm jaws, of course the standard jaws. I also got a set of these cold jaws, and I wound up with another set of 35mm bowl jaws. Frankly, I was overwhelmed. I couldn't figure out why anybody would need that many jaw sets. As it turns out, I didn't, because some of these fit me, some of them I almost never use. So it turns out if you're doing smaller things, you need a jaw that'll fit the appropriate spigot or tenon. This jaw set, Nova does not make one that will hold something closer to 35 millimeter like this jaw set by Sorby. So I had to invest in another set of jaws. Now this works great if you're doing a recess, but I don't generally use recesses. And I do a lot of small things with it, ornaments and coffee scoops and twig pots, and the list goes on. I need something where I can hold a piece of wood with a tenon quite a bit smaller than 2 inches, which would be, fit my standard chuck. Now what I found after the fact was the Record Power has a set of jaws very similar to this, except these are a true dovetail on the inside. The Record Power 35mm jaws has a design similar to the standard Nova jaws that has this tiny little hawk beak that bites into the wood, and I really like this design, and I wished I'd have known about it and I'd bought those jaws instead of these, but I can make do. This is a fine set of the jaws. It just wouldn't be my preference. Now let's talk a little bit about how the jaws are designed to hold wood. Here's an example of jaws that have serrations, and they grip the wood tightly. They also have a tiny dovetail here for smaller, to hold the bottom of a bowl, but you can hold something very large and get with a larger tenon and get a very strong grip with these serrations. This 35mm spigot set of jaws is very similar, except it doesn't have a dovetail. It's all serrations, and it's designed to hold on very strongly for hollow forms and goblets that extend out and grip tightly with these serrations. Other jaws have smooth walls. This one has a smooth wall on the outside, and it's got a unusual little gripping. These are pen jaws. These are designed to hold a piece of wood primarily for drilling, but it could be used for other items with small tenons. I've got some pen jaws. These are Nova jaws. They come in pairs, and they're for drilling out pen blanks, but they'll hold out any type of square stock.
So let me show you how that works. So we're going to take this blank, and it's just going to catch the corners, so it doesn't have to be perfectly square. It doesn't have to be milled lumber. This is a couple of scraps of sycamore. That 25mm bowl jaw set, and the virtually identical 35mm that Nova makes also has smooth jaws on the inside, but it has a dovetail on the outside. This one has a dovetail on the outside. This one has a dovetail on the outside for doing a recess. This 35mm has a dovetail on the outside, as does the power grip jaws, but dovetail inside and out. And these 100mm jaws has a dovetail on the inside and the outside. I don't turn many pins, and I don't do that much drilling of small stock, so these pin jaws are kind of a luxury, but every now and then they do come in handy. This spigot jaw, Nova says is for work where a long overhang is needed or hollowing into end grain. These jaws provide superior gripping power. Well, I don't tend to do a lot of that type of work. I don't do a lot of hollow forms, so they don't tend to get much use. This long set of jaws, I'll show you a picture of how they can use. They can be used for gripping on the inside of a bowl and having and getting the bowl away from the face of your chuck, away from the spindle, to make it easier to work on the back side. That's one feature. I've also found that they can be useful sometimes when you're turning something like a large box and you can fully recess it, and you have less of a chance of splitting out because most of the force is going to be down here near the bottom part of the box. So I use these occasionally, but not too often. Now these 100mm jaws really are a recent acquisition because they came with this Supernova chuck. I got a pretty good price on it. One of the features of it, frankly, for what I do, they do very little that can't be done equally well or better with the power grip jaws, which have about the same size, have a dovetail inside and outside for recess or a tenon. But I like the deeper length. I can put in a square block. It works for larger work. If I was doing something with a very large, long tenon, something of this nature, I could possibly clamp down with it without even bothering to take the time to make a real fine tenon on the piece of work. But one of the features of this particular jaw set that I thought I might use one of these days, it's got these extra holes in it used for screwing in a set of false jaws made out of wood, similar to what you might do if you use Nova soft jaws made out of some type of, I'll call it plastic, that you turn to meet your particular specifications for a given project. If you had to do it for many projects, it could get pretty expensive to do this, but you could do something similar by making wooden jaws for this chuck. This is one of a 4-jaw mini coal set that came used. Otherwise, I wouldn't have this. I never would have bought it. I hate it. Let me describe it more, what I like about it. Nothing. These rubber bushings are designed to catch the lip of a bowl, or if you've got it lip turned under, you could hang the bowl over it. But early in my turning career, I didn't know how to use them. I threw a few bowls, and I decided this was not for me, and I quickly moved up to a vacuum chuck and haven't looked back. But rather than do it this way, for reversing a bowl and finishing the bottom, I'd rather use the traditional approach where you just work on the bottom with tailstock support until you get a little nub, and then you just cut that off with a pocket knife or a sharp skew. Let's talk a little bit about capacity, and I would urge you to look at your manufacturer's guidance. But as a general rule of thumb, I would not want to use chuck jaws that are smaller than 25. This is bare minimum 25% of the diameter. So, for example, 2-inch jaws, you know, you really shouldn't be turning anything much more than 8 inches. The manufacturer says you could, for these jaws, the standard jaws, you could go up to a 12-inch bowl. Anything larger than that, and you're asking for trouble. Now with these power grip jaws, they're much larger and bigger. Although this is about 2 inches longer than its specification. It's great for gripping long extended projects out to, say, about here, out to, they say, a little over 12 inches. And that's where you get a lot of leverage, so you need a lot of gripping, and your chances are you're still going to wind up with some vibration. But this will also handle bowls up to a 16-inch diameter and 6 inches thick, and you couldn't get anywhere close to something like that with these standard jaws. Now, one of the considerations between smooth and or dovetail and serrated jaws are going to tend to damage the wood, and if you have to take the wood out and put it back in, you're going to have a very difficult time getting it to run true. You have a much better chance of it running true if you're using a dovetail, whether it's a recess or a tenon, getting it to run true. And if you got your tenon shape fitting at optimum size with the jaws almost closed, you'll get virtually no marking or damage from a dovetail set of jaws. Didn't want to get into different kinds of chucks. That's a religious war of this chuck versus that chuck. I discussed a little aspects of chuck buying in an earlier video. If you're interested, you might want to click here. And I'm not getting into every aspect of holding wood in this video. I've covered some of that before, including the woodworm screw. I'm interested in your comments. If you got any, please leave them below. Tell me what you find your favorite set of jaws are outside of your standard jaws. Y'all stay safe. Come on back here.